As we embark on our part 2 of growing through anxiety and depression, we're going to see the activity of God in such a beautiful and powerful way that if you really take these scriptures in, you're going to be overwhelmed by the love of God, by the pursuit of God, about God's knowing what is best for us. Last week, we looked at the first 5 verses. This week, we'll look at the remaining verses. It'll be the second part of verse 5 all the way down through verse 18. Last week, just in review, we looked at Elijah's personal struggle, the victory battle. That was the first point we looked at, the fact that he had come off of Mount Carmel and defeated all the prophets of Baal, but Ahab goes and delivers the word to his wife Jezebel about having been defeated. She says, I'll take care of this. She writes a death threat in a letter, gets it to Elijah, and it was the tipping point for him as he takes his eyes off of God and he places them on Jezebel's threat of his life. And so he's in this spiritual battle. We know the scripture said clearly last week that there was a consuming fear that overtook him that led to his decision to run and his separation from others. He told his servant that was with him to stay there, and he completely separated from everyone. And then we saw a sad surrender as he laid down, he prayed, went to sleep, asking the Lord to take his life. What a sad surrender it was. But now we're going to see in this second part, in the remaining verses, as I said, the activity of God and how beautiful and powerful it is. So I want to pick up the story, and this will be point number 6, as we'll make our way through all 12 points today, but this picks it up at point number 6, the God who pursues. In the second part of verse 5, it says, all at once an angel touched him and said, he fell asleep, prayed to die. But an angel touches him and says, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread that was baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and he drank, and then he laid down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and he ate and he drank, strengthened by that food. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and he spent the night. This is so interesting. We see Elijah sleeping, desiring to die, while an angel is preparing a meal for him. He has a cake over the fire, a jar of water. He needs nourishment. He doesn't know it, but he needs it. So the angel wakes Elijah up to eat. He eats and he goes back to sleep. I don't know about you, I've done that sometimes in the mornings. And then the angel comes back like a snooze alarm and wakes him up a second time. Michelle has to do that for me some mornings. Are you up? Yes, I'm up. Then I go back to sleep. She comes back in and says, you're still not up. Get up. Now, do any of y'all do that? One person. Greg and I are the only ones. Okay. Well, 3 of us. Elijah too. So Elijah, he gets a snooze alarm from the angel. He finally wakes up. He eats a second time. He regains his physical strength so he can embark on this 40-day and night journey to the mountain of God. God, listen, God is drawing him in to his presence. See, what I see here is the love of God at work. The encouragement of God coming into Elijah's life. He brings it through an angel. An angel brings some nudging and some nourishment and an invitation to meet with God on his mountain. Now, why is all this needed? We should stop and ask ourselves. And I'll answer it this way, simply because this is all needed because Elijah is worn out physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And we should stop and kind of take this in because this is important. Physically, there was a season of his life, we know for 3 years, that he was a man on the run, being led by the Lord, fed by the Lord. doing the work of the Lord. He had been expending spiritual energy through prayer. He had confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. He had also run ahead of Ahab to Jezreel. That was 17 miles, if you remember. And all of that activity of his life, listen, was sustained spiritually by God. But now, where he is separated from God, fear has consumed him. He now travels 120 miles as he runs from Mount Carmel to Beersheba to escape Jezebel. And then it tells us he goes another day's journey even after that to get to the broom tree. So all of this physical exertion brings about physical exhaustion because he is running in his own strength. And I want to say to you today, that's an easy thing to do. To stop depending on God and start doing it yourself. And some of you today are in that position. You're here today and you're listening, and I believe God's going to use it in your life to draw you back to His presence, His strength, His way, His will, not your strength, your way, or your will. He wants us to do it His way in His strength for His glory, not our own. All that simply to say, I believe that Elijah is completely and totally physically exhausted. Have you ever been there? We all can get there. And it can be a very dangerous place to be because when you're physically exhausted, you begin to think things you shouldn't think, and you feel things that you shouldn't probably feel because you're physically exhausted. Elijah was. He was emotionally drained as well. We said this last week and established this. We believe that he was totally disappointed in the fact that everyone didn't turn to God, even Jezebel, to the point that it was a false summit for him in that he thought victory had been gained, but yet here's Jezebel challenging him, and it just kind of deflates him and defeats him. And then spiritually, we know that in his prayer, he had concluded that he had failed. He was worse than all the other prophets. He is concluding that God is not capable. And so he takes the matter on himself. Elijah had been and was under spiritual attack. And the temptation was to stop depending on God and to do it himself. And so what we find here is that Elijah has given in, he's given out, and he is worn out. And that is all very important to grasp because you and I, we take that same road. Now, it may look different for each one of us, but all those elements are involved if we get to a state of full-blown depression like Elijah was in. And so you have to look at all those elements. It's important to do it. So I want to ask you a question. Are you worn out physically? Are you worn out emotionally? Are you worn out spiritually? You should take inventory of your life and answer in each of those categories where you are. And if you're doing great today, I praise the Lord for that, but you're going to face some times in your life where you can be worn out in all three of these areas. So learn today well. And if you are worn out, let the Lord renew your strength today in all three areas. It encourages me to watch how God worked in Elijah, because how He worked in Elijah means that's how He works in me. I see how God allowed Elijah to sleep. He finally got to where he was running, some 120 plus miles away, and he goes to sleep. And I believe the Lord let him sleep because He knew he needed it. See, sleep for restoration is good, but sleep for escape is dangerous. And in depression, oftentimes, we just want to go to bed. We want to pull the covers over our head, cut the lights out, block everything out as though we're not responsible for anything, and we have nothing left to give, nowhere to invest, no purpose for life, and we just want to go to sleep. That's really where Elijah was. But I think God just let him sleep enough to be restored physically. And there's nothing wrong with restoration sleep, but escape sleep is very dangerous. God meets Elijah's physical needs. Interestingly enough, He prepared a meal for him, provided some water for him. He has physical needs. You and I have physical needs. We have to drink so much water. We have to eat so many calories. We have to have fuel to exist and function, and he knew Elijah needed that. In a state of depression, oftentimes we set those things aside. We don't take care of our physical needs like we should. because we're so wrapped up in the depression and in the fact that we feel like there's no need to go forward, we don't take care of ourselves as we should. Yet Elijah is having his physical needs met by God through the angel. That's a beautiful picture of God's love. So he's meeting his physical needs, although God knows he's not ready spiritually. He's not healthy spiritually, but he knows to meet the physical needs will allow him to get to a spot then to be restored spiritually. It's interesting to me as well that God sends Elijah on a journey, which will get him some much needed, I think, exercise. 40 days walking across the desert, talking to God, walking, clearing your mind, allowing the blood to flow can help you think clear and sometimes feel better. Physical exercise is a good thing. Sometimes we want to crawl in the bed and we want to give up. And if you give up, you'll deteriorate. You've got to have some movement and motion in your life. I think it can be a very beneficial thing to do so. And the Lord allows this as well. And all of it on his way to travel to the mountain of Horeb. Those are good things, but the ultimate thing, all of those things are leading to the very fact that God needs him to come into his presence. See, God's interested in restoration and revelation of truth that Elijah needs. I think Elijah might have been thinking, God's going to take me up here. This is going to be retribution and retaliation because I failed. But that's not the case. God is all about the restoration and the revelation of truth that he would need to help him see and be enlightened again to understand the plan of God. This is the God who is pursuing Elijah, and it is the God who pursues us. The next point, point 7, we see the God who confronts. Did you know that a person, if you're really loved by another individual, they'll confront you when you need to be confronted? And here we are going to see that Elijah will be confronted. It says in the second part of verse 9, and the word of the Lord came to him. That's strong. You know what you and I need? We need the word of the Lord to come to us. That's the only place we get perspective. It's the only place we find our power. It's the presence of God when his word comes to us, and it came to Elijah. And what Elijah needed at this moment is what God said to him, which was simply this: what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? See, I think Elijah in his exhaustion ran to a place he thought would allow him to escape his greatest fears. Fear of death, fear of Jezebel, fear of personal failure. But instead, when God asked this question, he is calling Elijah, listen, to face his fears. If you want to get out of depression, you have to face your fears from God's perspective. That's the bottom line. God's calling him to face his fears. I'm never going to prosper. I'm never going to get perspective. I'm never going to have peace. I'm never going to live by faith. I'm never going to trust God if I'm consumed with my fears and my failures. And the same is true for you. When I've taken, like Elijah, the self-appointed path to run, separate, and pray to die, there is a confidence that I can have that God lovingly confronts me to bring me back just like he did Elijah. Sometimes in the hallways here at the school, I'll hear teachers engage students, and they say something like this: Elijah, what are you doing here? Hey, why are you over here? Why are you over in this part of the school when you're supposed to be over here? And what are you doing? All those types and kinds of questions are confrontational questions with love in order to help the student get to where they need to be, to confront them in love. Don't parents do this when they see their kids get in sin? Why are you doing this? Why are you going over here and participating in these things? Why are you making these decisions? And in love, they confront them to help them wake up and say, why are you doing this? And see, if we see this, that this is God asking this question because he's bringing Elijah to a point to wake up. Really answer this question, Elijah, what are you doing here? Such a great question. And I have to ask you today, is God asking you that question? He's asked me that question many times. You know, I'm down and discouraged, and I'll go and do something, not carrying out what God wants me to do, and God will nudge me and He'll say, Mark, what are you doing here? You need to go back and do what I asked you to do. And that's really what's going on here. Is He asking you that question? He's a God who will confront. Next, I want you to see, eighth, the honest reply that He gives. And He says in verse 10, He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Let me say something about this reply. I appreciate Elijah's honesty in this reply. He just lays it out there before the Lord. And I think that's a healthy thing to do, actually. I don't think he's trying to get one over on God. Now, I think there's some aspects of this prayer that are not on target and they're not healthy, but I am going to say, and I'll give it to Elijah, I believe it's his honesty before God. When he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, that is true, he had been. When he said, the Israelites have rejected your covenant, well, God was aware of that, and it was true. When He said they've broken down your altars, that's the same. It was true. When He said they put the prophets to death with the sword, and I'm the only one left, not true. He'll figure that out very soon, but that was not true. But when He went on to say they're trying to kill me, that was true. They were trying to kill Him. He did get the note from Jezebel. And the bottom line in it all is that he feels alone. Elijah is feeling alone. Completely alone. And it's a classic sign of depression that we feel all alone, we feel helpless, and we feel hopeless, which is really a definition of what depression is. I think Elijah felt like he'd done all he can do. How could he continue? The people aren't turning back as they should. People are not seeking and serving God like they should. What in the world? God, this is all resting on me, and I failed, and nobody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, and this is terrible, and oh, this is awful. And in some ways, what you begin to see here in the honesty of his reply is that there is a measure for Elijah, but because, listen, he's lost God's perspective, and this is why this happens. He is filled with self-pity. It's pervasive in his prayer. Self-pity simply means you're feeling sorry for yourself. You take the full responsibility on yourself. You blame yourself. It's all about you. In such a state will fight against any measure of getting healthy and moving forward. I like to call it the woe is me syndrome. Woe is me is a terrible place to live. You ever lived there? Oh, woe is me. Life is terrible. And you know what? It is. For Elijah. That's real. That's very, very real for him. And oftentimes it's very real for us. And that's why the depression is so real when it comes. But it's not God's perspective. It becomes our perspective that rules and reigns instead of God's. Woe is me will typically blame others and God for their state of despair. Oh, this is my fault. And oh, God, let this happen. And oh, God, why you put me in such a tough spot? And oh, God. I mean, you live like that for very long, you won't have any desire to live. You'll be like Elijah under a broom tree, praying to die and going to sleep. Woe is me tends to exaggerate problems, making them worse than what they really are. All of this feeds the flesh, and when the flesh is fed by fear, it totally moves into despair and depression. You say, well, okay, I don't want to go there. Well, here's some things you can do. Stop making excuses. Address the problem from God's point of view. Own it. Whatever it is, own it. And say, God, help me see what you see. And when you do, I believe you'll begin to take the steps forward out of your state of depression. And any steps, small steps, any steps, all steps, whatever they are a step away from the mire and the darkness that has consumed you and desiring to destroy you. Move toward God. What I love about this whole part of his reply is you can say that his reply is a prayer. And it is a prayer. He's talking to God. And what I love about that is this. The very fact that, yes, he spoke honestly. Now, he's limited in his perspective because this is all about him. Yes, there is self-pity. But here's the encouraging part is he's still talking to God. And when we fail to stop talking to God, that's when things get really, really dark. But he's still praying. He's still communicating. He's doing it honestly. This is not like sin that separates us and God won't hear our prayer. You know, Isaiah 59:2 says that's the case, but your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sin has hidden his face from you so that you will not hear. I believe that's true. That is a complete act of rebellion in the heart where you're not open to God at all, even though you may be trying to pray. There's no measure of openness and sensitivity in the heart. Yes, Elijah is in sin, self-pity sin, lack of allowing God's perspective to be there. Fear is sin because it's not faith. Yes, those are true, but yet there's still an openness, so God's still working. The connection's still there. They're working it out. They're working it through God and Elijah together. And that's why there's still hope in this situation. God hears the honest praying. No, he's not perfect, but he's still praying with honesty. God's still working. The ninth thing I want you to see is this: the God who continues. He continues to draw us into his presence. Watch verse 11. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. So you just got to kind of imagine something like that. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. I've experienced an earthquake twice, very small, once in Atlanta, once here in Augusta. And both times, it'll definitely get your attention. I feel sure this got Elijah's attention. But after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face. He went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Boy, that's familiar, isn't it? See, Elijah had already heard the voice of the Lord in verse 9. He had answered honestly in verse 10. So we raise the question, what is going on here? And what is this all about in verses 11 through 13? And what it's about is the very fact that God is calling Elijah into his presence. It is a picture of his continued, gracious, patient process of restoring his depressed servant. That's what this is. Elijah gets a directive to go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. And when he does, there's a demonstration of the power of God. The wind, the earthquake, and the fire. And I really believe convictionally that what this is about is a display of the power of God compared to what was consuming Elijah with fear, and that was Jezebel. Can Jezebel create a wind like that? Can Jezebel bring about an earthquake like that? Can Jezebel bring about a fire like that? And the answer is to no in all three. And I think God was simply reminding Elijah of who he was, how great he was, and that he was way greater, immensely beyond our comprehension, greater than the fear that was consuming Elijah. And I want to ask once again, as I did last week, what is the fear that's consuming you? And whatever it is, you say, okay, here, this is what it is. My question to you is it greater than the God of the wind and the earthquake and the fire, the demonstration of the power of who God is? And the answer unequivocally is simply nothing is greater than God. So whatever fear has consumed us, whatever fear has taken us to a point of a dark place of full-blown depression, it is not greater than God. And I believe that's what this demonstration of the power of God is all about. Then there is a decision to engage. He's told by God to come out of the cave into the presence of God. And in so doing, he hears the voice of God. And what happens? He doesn't say, hey, Elijah, you see how great I am? Hey, Elijah, look at me. Look how great I am. He doesn't do any of that. He puts it back on Elijah once again. He says, Elijah, what are you doing here? Elijah, what are you doing here? Doesn't God have a way to get down to what really matters? The matter of our hearts, that which is consuming us. He knows how to ask the right questions. And what I found is God will ask them over and over again until we deal with them. Can there come a point where God doesn't ask anymore? There can. Scripturally, you can show that, prove that, make a case for that. That's a very dangerous place to get when God no longer convicts, engages, pursues. Romans 1 calls it being turned over to what we demand, even though we know God. Very dangerous. But here he continues, and he's asking over and over again. Let me ask you a question. What's God asking you over and over again? What is it that he keeps working out in your life? You run over here and you get into trouble and things don't work out. Then you run over here and you get into trouble and those things don't work out and you run over here. And there's a pattern. But yet all the time in each one and every one of those, God is still asking us the same question to bring us back to himself. Interestingly enough, point number 10, the same reply comes in verse 14. I won't read the whole thing. I've been zealous for the Lord. They've rejected your covenant, torn down your altars. Nobody's left. They're going to kill me. Same answer. So Elijah's convinced. He gives the same answer, even though the display of God and his power, and the question comes again. But now what's going to happen is the Lord's going to move him to a point of decision, to a crossroads, to either do it God's way or do it his way. When he reveals truth to him in the next two verses. Point number 11, this is the crossroads. It is the call to obey. And Elijah will have to make a decision. Verse 15 says, the Lord said to him, underline these two words, they're powerful words, go back. Go back. Man, the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint. He's got three he's got to anoint. Hazael, Jehu, Elisha. All of these. But let's talk about the go back. This had to be shocking for him to hear these words. Go back the way you came. What? What do you mean, God? What? Here's what I want to tell you. We don't like to go back because we don't like to face our fears. We don't like to appear that we've been wrong in any way. But we're called to go back many times. I remember when I was in college, it's very distinct for me. This may not make a lot of sense for you, but this is very distinct and personal for me. I finished my first year at Liberty University, decided that wasn't the college for me. I wanted to go somewhere else. I wanted to move out, spread my wings. So I got a plan and was able to get a promotion with my job and moved to South Florida. I had some relatives there, stayed with them for the summer, started this new job. Then I would go to school at West Palm. I thought for the remainder of my college it wouldn't end up that way. But as I left town, I remember this distinctly. I was in my car, Datsun 200SX, I don't make those anymore. And I was driving out of town, man, I was so excited to leave. I couldn't wait to get to I-95 and just drive south. And as I was leaving town, a friend of mine pulled up beside me on the road, rolled the window down. I rolled my window down. He said, hey, man, what you doing today? I said, I'm leaving town. He said, where are you going? I said, I'm leaving. I'm going to Florida. He said, when are you coming back? I said, I'm never coming back. I told him that. I think he said, okay. Rolled his window up and went on. I rolled mine up and went south. And I remember that I was dead set I wasn't coming back. About 6 months into the whole deal, was sitting on the back row, First Baptist West Palm. Jack Graham preached a sermon, Isaiah chapter 40, on the wings of eagles, about the Lord renewing strength. I'm not sure exactly what all that had to do with it. God was touching my life, calling me into ministry. It was a breaking process in the middle of that message where I dealt with God and God was dealing with me, and I said, Lord, I'll do whatever it is you want me to do. And he said, okay, I know what I want you to do. And I'm serious. He said, I want you to go back to where you came from. And there was a moment there I thought, well, I don't want to go back. I already told everybody I was never coming back. Go back where, Lord? I want you to go back home. Go back and live with your parents. Really, Lord? Go back to Liberty. Go to Liberty. I don't want to go back to Liberty. Go to Liberty. Go home. Face all your friends you told that you were never coming back. Now, to a young man, that's a big deal. To you, you're thinking, it's not a big deal. Lord will take care of you. But at that moment, I'm telling you, there was this, and I said, okay, Lord, I give up. I'll go back. I packed my bags, and I left, and I went home. My sister had come to school there, and we were going to go that whole year together. She said, where are you going? I said, I'm going home. She goes, what am I supposed to do? I said, I don't know, but I'm going home. See ya. I left her in Florida and went home. But God knew best for me, and there was a breaking of my pride. There was a breaking of the things that were fearful to me and things I didn't want to do, but God knew best for me, and He said, Mark, in this instance for me, go back. Now, sometimes God says, go forward somewhere you don't want to go. But for me, it was go back in order that I could go forward. And that was true here. Where was he to go? He was to go to the desert of Damascus. Why? What's there? What's going on right now? What in the world am I going to go to a desert? Well, he would go there to go to work because there were those who needed to be anointed, to anoint Hazael and Jehu and Elijah. Maybe he didn't understand it fully, what's going on with all of this. But the one thing he knew, it's the one thing I knew as I sat on that back row in that church that day was, I may not know, but this is clear to me, this is what I'm supposed to do. And Elijah knew that. And so really it is a call to obey and to do it now. That's what obedience is. See, God had the bigger plan. God knew what was right, and He was going to reveal it to him as he was and as he would go, that God knew best. And listen to me, in the obedience of the going would be the removal of the depression that had caused him to sleep and want to die. Elijah was realizing that God had other soldiers in his army. Elijah was realizing that he was not the only one. He was going to be a part of bringing the next generation along to do the work of God. And to realize, I'm not the only one. I had that wrong. It would be a call to believe. The 12th point, verses 17 and 18. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elijah will put to death any of those who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. Whew. I'm telling you, this is major revelation from God to Elijah. This was his crossroads of obedience to believe. He's showing Elijah his assumption that led to his fear, that brought about his depression, was all, listen, off base. He created it all. The devil took it and used it against him, and God's revealing to him that he's in control, not Jezebel. God knew the bigger picture. God had a three-phase plan. Attack one would come from Hazael. If any are left, then Jehu. Any left there, Elijah. It was a three-part plan to take care of everything. In fact, he reveals to him, guess what, Elijah? I've got 7,000 that you don't know anything about, and they have not bowed down to Baal or kissed him. They're faithful to me. Whew. What do you make of all this? I tell you what I make of it is that Elijah is brought out of his depression and he's placed back in service by the loving presence of God. What an encouragement. You say, what am I supposed to do? I would say to you, if you're in depression, I say it to myself, get into the presence of the Lord. Hear the voice of the Lord. Go the direction the Lord sends you. It's really just that easy, even if He says, go back. Warren Wiersbe says, God was saying to Elijah, stop complaining and grieving over your seeming failures. Get back to work. Yeah. And He did it in a very loving way. Ray Pritchard, I came across his testimony concerning this particular passage in relation to his own life, and I want to share with you his testimony. He said, a few months ago, I was complaining about something. He was a pastor in Chicago. He said, I was complaining about something that had happened. My wife listened to me complain for a while, and then she listened some more. Finally, she decided she'd heard enough. So she said what wives have said to complaining husbands since the beginning of time. Grow up. I didn't like that at all. For one thing, I didn't want to grow up. I wanted to complain. So my wife said to me, stop complaining and open your eyes and see how good God has been to us. She was right, of course. So we started to play a little game to see how many God sightings we could find every day. And you know what we found? We discovered that if we paid attention every day, there were always a handful of God sightings, of God doing something, a phone call or somebody dropping by, an unexpected word of kindness, or a card in the mail or an answered prayer. Sometimes it's just the small little things God would do, just something that caused us to say, that was the Lord who did that for us. We learned that if we keep our eyes open for God, pretty soon we'll see Him everywhere. In closing, I would say to you, depression is real. It is an overwhelming feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And we learn from Elijah what caused his depression was this. He took his eyes off of God and he placed them on Jezebel. What would cure his depression was he had to take his eyes off of Jezebel and place them back on God. Do you need to do the same? Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, what a beautiful, beautiful, incredible passage of your love, your working, your way. You, God, you are God. We acknowledge that today. The God of incredible power, the God who has a plan, the God who pulls us out of depression and places us back in service for your glory. Father, whoever is here and is struggling, may they be consumed with your presence right now, and they would listen clearly and obey. And may you be glorified in it all. Church, I'm going to ask you to stand, and the altar is open for you to come and pray. If you need to pray for someone who's in depression, come and just lift them up. If you need to grab somebody's hand and come pray, do that. If you just can come pray yourself, the altar's open. Let God be God in your life today.